Hello, I'm your host, Mike Gelb, and this is The Consumer VC. We discuss the intersection of venture capital and consumer innovation. This show is brought to you by Propeller Industries, the leading strategic finance and accounting partner for venture stage companies. Now, I know this is free content, but that doesn't mean I don't have a favor to ask of you. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe on whichever channel or platform that you're listening on, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple. And if you really love the show, check out theconsumervc.com and subscribe to our email, where you'll receive weekly updates of all the consumer deals and news that are happening, and as well as being the first to know when a new episode drops. All content episodes are for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. Our guest today is Marcel Bens, who is the CEO of Emil Capital. Emil Capital is an early stage investment firm that backs the next generation of consumer brands. They are backed by the Tangleman Group, which is one of the world's largest consumer goods holding companies today. Now, some of their investments include Renewal Mill, Wish, Uber, and Milk and Honey. We discuss key factors when evaluating potential investments in the wellness and better for you food and beverage sectors. Also, what the current state of the market is for investing in consumer brands. And will GLP-1 drugs change global food consumption habits? And more. Without further ado, here's Marcel. Marcel, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you. Thanks, Mike, for having me.
No, really appreciate you coming on. I know that this has been rescheduled a couple of times on my end, so thanks so much for bearing with me. I want to start a little bit at the founding of Emil Capital and a bit about the capital structure of the investment firm. Seems like you're the venture arm of Tangleman Group, but if you're able to present the reason why it made sense as well for the Tangleman Group to launch Emil Capital, and since we're in the US, people might not be as familiar with the Tangleman Group as well. So if you can give a little backstory about that. I know Emil is the name stems from the founder or one of the co-founders of Tangleman Group. But if you can give us a little background about the fund and as well as Tangleman Group as well, and a little bit about that relationship, that'd be awesome.
So we are, we're a bit of a hybrid venture firm. We are structured like a venture capital firm, but with a single LP, which, as you mentioned, is the Tangleman Group. We were brought in, we were incepted about 12 years ago. Two founders, one of which is the fifth generation family member who's 5 generations ago started the Tangleman Group, and then one of another senior partner. So together they started. I joined at inception. That was in 2011. And we've been investing in consumer products ever since. Now, the mandate that was interesting for Tangleman is North America. The family over many generations have always had a very, very close ties to the United States. So the Tangleman Group used to own the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, so AMP. They bought the majority back in the 70s and held on to it for a long time. So the ties to the US were always there. And then the strategy was, from a Tangleman perspective, I assume, not knowing all the details, was just diversification, regional diversification, and investing in a category that they believed in was going to grow. And so the mandate, where we sat around the table and say, what do we want to do, is investing in better for you brands, better for you consumer brands that solve a real problem. This was at a time when, of course, you had your Whole Foods and you had your growing organic aisles, but it wasn't mainstream yet. Better for you was not, was not there where it is today. So that's number one. That's, let's say, more the category that we were interested in. And the other thing was the check sizes, right? At that time, now you see this, obviously much more often. But back then in the consumer space, you had, angel investors, and then you had larger private equity, but you didn't really have so much in the middle, companies that would write a, $1 to $5 million check. You'd have angel investors doing 100,000, or then larger private equity doing 15, 20. But getting the company in the consumer space over that edge to get into the private equity takes takes capital. And so we thought that was a white space. Turned out it was a white space. And so, let's say from an investment strategy perspective, that's what we then started doing. And the Tangleman Group in itself is a retail conglomerate based out of Europe. Again, 150 years old. I think maybe now 160 years old. It started as a large merchant company, so importing coffee and chocolate, so cocoa, into Europe and distributing it, and then over time developed into kind of a retail conglomerate.
That's really helpful. How $1 to $5 million checks, how do you think as well around the amount of companies that you actually want to invest in over a year basis? Is it kind of more so of an evergreen fund? I know it's single LP, but how does that actual relationship kind of work? And as well as what's the kind of deployment schedule, or how often are you investing into companies?
Yeah, so we're on our, I would say technically on our third fund right now. Again, scheduled as a typical fund with a 3 to 4 year investment period of the capital that's committed. We do typical capital calls to our LP. Again, single LP obviously makes that easier, but it's basically the same structure. Now, the uniqueness is that our investment committee is, the CEO of the Tangleman Group is part of our investment committee. So is the other senior partner, who's the other co-founder who started Emil Capital, and myself. So we're an investment committee of 3 people, with 2 of them being very closely tied to the Tangleman Group, and then myself as CEO of Emil Capital.
I understand that it's very separate. It's not a CVC because you're not thinking about strategic, or hey, we want to invest in this company early and then maybe have a chance to buy it later on if it pans out. But how also do you think about value when it comes to utilizing the mass amount of resources that the Tangleman Group uses for the portfolio companies? Are you able to utilize some of those resources, or not so much, or not so much? That's not as much the mandate.
Yeah, I mean, we do it obviously through our network, and the people that we know and talking to experts. Again, this is a predominantly European business, so it's not like we help in distribution, right, or selling the product. But of course, given it is a retail conglomerate, there are many people we can talk to and get advice. How to do this. Or that, how can we support the businesses that we invest in? So the relationship is extremely close, which is good because that's how we learn, right? That's how we can always be very transparent with our LPs. So it's not like there's quarterly meetings or a quarterly financial report and then that's it. I mean, we're in close contact on a very, very regular basis, and that's beneficial because the strategy around our investment is also related to what are the values of the firm values, so the Tangleman firm values, and the values, quite frankly, of the family, right, that still runs it. Like, what do they believe in? And so we try to closely align with that firm family values, which then of course mirrors the investment strategy and categories we like to invest in at Emil Capital.
So I know you mentioned that the primary goal for setting up this fund was investing in better for you businesses, and at the time you were investing in better for you businesses when better for you businesses was still really the natural grocery sector, right? It hadn't really expanded into conventional grocery. And it seems like we've kind of crossed that chasm from going to natural and conventional, maybe from niche to mainstream. Were there any key moments along this path over the past, 10 or so years that you thought this is really kind of an inflection point, that we've actually now seen this transition of the consumer more thinking and not just, maybe the consumer that's just buying in the natural sector, but maybe consumers that are buying, in general stores as well, or conventional as well, that if there were kind of like moments in time that you thought that this chasm was crossed or even beginning to turn over?
Yeah, it's when your conventional retailers start having dedicated aisles for organic products. Um, I think that's when you saw that inflection point that it's you don't just buy organic products or better for you products in a Whole Foods. It's going mainstream, right? When it starts popping up at the big retailers, and then the conversation, right? The conversation of the consumer on the content creation, the social media development around, how do we solve problems for the consumer? And that's kind of more how we thought about this. It wasn't just let's only invest in better for you, but it's really around how can we solve real problems that the consumer has through better for you options, right? Services and products. And so we've always been agnostic, category agnostic. We've invested in companies not just in food and beverage, but for us it was really important to always look at, are we solving a problem? Are we offering something beneficial, a better option for the consumer? And again, the inflection points are is if mainstream, conventional retailers start putting more of those products, better for you products on the shelf, right? And that of course is related to, as you see bigger companies, the big strategics interested in purchasing through M&A, right? Either merging, like a typical M&A transaction, you would see more of these companies being acquired by strategics. And that was interesting, right? Because now you have a market of investing in those companies.
That's really, really interesting. I mean, a, a conversation that I had that on this podcast was with Clement from Verl Invest, who's I think the executive director at Verl
I
Invest,
know
and
him.
he said that and he was saying how the ideal scenario is in sticking right now for a minute on food and beverage, but kind of the ideal scenario is if the company has performed quite well in natural, and then as well as there's a really an opportunity in conventional to be an incredible business and actually be able to penetrate conventional very strong, especially as you pointed out, conventional retailers now have organic sections, they have dedicated sections to better for you in the larger chains. First of all, is that also how you think about it? And two, what what are better for you products when you look at the wide ranging now of so many better for you products coming to market? What are kind of some of the attributes that actually you think that you look out for, that you realize, okay, this could actually be a much bigger business than it currently is, and maybe go across different retailers, different sales channels?
Yeah, no, great questions. I think the answer to both are very similar. The way that we really look at companies, and that's maybe what Clement was also referring to, is you don't need national distribution to be an exciting brand, right? What you need to show is repeat purchases, loyalty, right? And how do you create loyalty? Again, it's you solve a problem, right? You solve a problem for a consumer, which is the functional part of that equation. And then, of course, you need to make it interesting and fun, and that's the emotional part of that equation. Once you have, once you've solved for that, then I think you have an interesting brand. And so our recommendation is always own a own a certain distribution channel, a region. You don't have to go broad, but you go deep and focus on velocities, right? Focus on repeat purchases. A lot of investors and also companies focus a lot on customer acquisition. For us, that is just step one. Most important thing is loyalty, right? And that's repeat purchases and that's high velocity. And so I think I would answer both questions with exactly that. What makes it interesting is the company that can solve kind of the functional aspect and the emotional aspect. Then you have kind of a winning equation in my view.
But what about price as well? Because, for example, if you're like if you're in natural grocery and the consumer might have more disposable income, might be willing to spend more, for example, on your product, when you transition to conventional grocery, it's possible. I know that these lines are now getting blurred quite a bit, but it's possible that you might have people that have very similar views, that they want to be eating better, might not have as much disposable income, might not be able to actually work. And of course, you need to kind of stay at consistent velocities in order for, the Walmarts of the world, the Targets of the world to keep wanting you back for more. So how do you also analyze companies that not only are solving a problem, is a great product, but also is priced correctly where it actually can be a long lasting business?
Yeah, no, look, that's a great question. Yes, prices tend to be higher for certain products in the natural. You want to, if you go conventional, there's more price sensitivity. Again, I do think the way you solve it is by a product that's functional, right? A product that attaches itself emotionally and functional to the consumer, and that's why that's really what we're looking at. And if you have that, the consumer will be willing to pay a premium, right? Because it's not just a Me Too product. Now, when we look at companies, we do of course look at their margin structure and also analyze whether these products are whether they make sense in the conventional chain. For us, it's always important to kind of go for the masses, to have a large addressable market. And so we look at investments where we can see the product margin um, uh, in a good shape so that we can go after both natural and conventional channel. But again, I think there are a lot of great premium products out there, even in, let's say, a more price sensitive retail environment. Right? I'll give you an example. One of our investments, their biggest account is Aldi, right? And this is a premium product. And the velocity it's the biggest account. Is Aldi. And you would say like, huh, that's interesting. Why? It's not a cheap product, not cheap to make, and it's a premium product. But the biggest account in retail is Aldi, which I think is a great case study that you can see that people who they are willing to pay a premium if they know the product works, the product is efficacious, it's functional, it tastes good, high quality, organic. People will pay for that.
Yeah, I mean, I also think, talking to brands, I think it's also really interesting when going into conventional was actually their first road to retail and not natural. And I think that's also pretty cool, because you can there's tends to be, and again, these things are changing, but tends to be more price sensitivity in conventional than natural. And I think that you're almost doing the hard work up front in a lot of ways. Still, you have to obviously get into natural, which getting into a new account is always challenging. But if you're able to prove yourself out in conventional, then I think it's pretty interesting, because in the in the natural channel, it might be a little bit easier as well, which is pretty cool.
No, you're absolutely right. Again, there are many brands out there now. This brand at Aldi that I was referring to is a company called Good Belly. They manufacture probiotic juices, so a premium product, a very efficacious premium product. But one example in our portfolio is a company called Kid Fresh. They started in conventional, and then they went into natural, and they make frozen healthy frozen kids meals, right? And the strategy was, we want to offer healthier products at a similar price to the consumer than what was there before. Great strategy.
Why you mentioned probiotics? Why do you think gut health has become such a significant focus in the health and wellness industry?
Yeah, because I think people are understanding the benefits, right? I think the previously everybody was, when referring to probiotics, thinking about the science behind it, explaining way too much about the science, but not really about what does it actually do to you. And more research that you can read explains these benefits, that it's not just in the gut, but it has cognitive benefits. But what most people are surprised about is the that 70% of our immune system is dictated by our gut. and that the gut is very individual, very personalized. So not every probiotic works for every individual the same way. And so I think it's interesting for us as an investment strategy. There are two other categories that I would jump into, that I would add to this. That kind of frames in our world the whole body health world. But gut health is interesting because I think there's still so much to find out on how to understand the microbiome of each individual. And that's personalized. I mean, there's a great Netflix documentary that came out a couple months ago called Hack Your Health. Everybody should watch that. It's super interesting, and it kind of substantiated our investment strategy around investing in companies that analyze the microbiome, that try to come up with better solutions for the microbiome, but generally also gut health solutions. Now, the other two categories I would add to that I think right now are the most exciting consumer categories or better for you categories is recovery. So exercise, post-workout recovery, and sleep. And if you look at those three categories and you look at the conversation in the world, in the consumer world, those are the biggest, hottest trends that I see right now in the consumer category that are not just me too. Now, you need to differentiate yourself in these categories by offering efficacious products, right? Again, with that emotional connection, and that's the exciting part. But I think those three categories are going to be interesting for us in the next decade, and that's where we've placed some significant capital into companies to grow those.
So, I mean, within those spaces, exercise, post recovery, and sleep, what companies? I know you've obviously feel free to mention to your portfolio companies, but what pain points kind of excite you in those areas that you think are being solved, and maybe what are some pain points as well that haven't been solved yet that you're very excited for this new frontier?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, I'm biased with the company that we've invested in, a company called Next Foods that focuses exactly on those things. It's two brands, Cherry Bundy and Good Belly. Cherry Bundy focuses on exercise recovery and and sleep, and Good Belly on gut health. Now, the interesting part about that is these are all natural products, right? It's all about using science, but kind of going against science-based products with all natural offerings. And that's what we think is exciting. The pain points are price, right? These are agricultural products. These are fruit juices, concentrates. This is a tart cherry that grows from a tree. Those are pain points more from an operational cost perspective that makes it a premium product, right? But the benefits are clear. But to your question, what are the pain points? I think pricing is a pain point with premium products in that space to get it to the masses. But I also think that once consumers realize the efficaciousness of these products, they're willing to pay that. But it is an agricultural product. You have a lot of companies that are really more science based. That's where I would wonder how beneficial, like what are you putting into your body, and we know from the educated consumer, they are worried about what they're putting into their body. And so for me, that would be another pain point on the mass of products that are coming into the market in those categories. Number one, are they really efficacious? And number two, what's kind of the ingredient list, right? Like what are you putting inside your body? And yeah, that's where I would be concerned.
This episode is brought to you by Propeller Industries. If you run a high growth business and you're focused on profitability, extending your runway, and improving your operational efficiency, you probably need a finance and accounting whiz that will grow with you. Well, instead of hiring someone full time, what would be cost effective is working with Propeller Industries. Propeller Industries is a leading strategic finance and accounting partner for venture stage companies and has partnered with over 1,000 startups and high growth businesses across consumer products, consumer tech, and enterprise. Some of the brands that they've worked with are Liquid Death, Olipop, Hims, Farmer's Dog, Away, MoviePass, and Giphy. Propeller also provides specialized support for fundraising and M&A with transaction advisory services. Propeller's TA team of former investment bankers and investors can step in on more of a project basis when pursuing full-scale financing and M&A. There's a link to Propeller Industries in the show notes if you want to learn more information.
From the ingredient choices, and I know this is a bit of a broad question and it can be fairly category dependent, but what ingredients stick out to you when you actually go into it? Could be ingredient list, or maybe actually a better way to phrase it is the actual nutrition label. Is there products that what would kind of stick out to you if you're reading like nutrition labels and seeing, oh wow, like this is actually not nearly as good for you, for example, as the marketing says for you? Is there specific like things that you kind of look for when it comes to nutrition labels to make sure that what the product actually says is actually in your terms? I know healthy, it's a funny phrase because
I think therein lies the problem, right? Because there's so much that you don't understand that's on ingredient panels, nutrition panels, ingredient lists. I think the way that we often look at this is, do you understand, does an intelligent 14-year-old or 16-year-old person, consumer, understand the ingredients? I think that's a good bar to have with the better for you category. If it's, a ingredient list that has 50 ingredients and 80% of those you don't really understand, that would concern me. And I think you see that in the market, right? The whole movement towards clean label in food and beverage is very important. You want to know what you're putting inside your body. You want to understand the ingredients, and that's not always the case.
can you also just say what clean label means to you?
I think it depends on the category, but if it's better, I think it depends on the category, right? But in general, if it's food and beverage, if it's products that you understand, that's really plain and simple. So if it says tart cherry on there and it's tart cherry, if it says water on there and it's water, if it says fruit juice concentrates or agave syrup, those things are. But any kind of colorings, chemical colorings, preservatives that aren't natural. That's where I would get concerned. Now, doesn't mean that all those products are necessarily unhealthy, but clean ingredients for me are ingredients that you understand.
When you walk into a convention, a expo hall, let's say like an Expo West, for example, and there's millions, what seems like millions of brands, right? It's pretty overwhelming. How do you, and of course you only have, even though it's over a 3 to 4 day period, you only have a little bit of time, really, just because there's thousands of brands that are presenting. How do you make decisions in terms of and really understand when you do want to discover new brands to potentially invest in and really be on the journey with a founder? How do you make decisions in terms of which brands actually you want to spend time with, and which brands you want to you want to pass on, or is maybe not worth your time that day?
Yeah. Well, maybe a little anecdote story there, because well, I haven't been at Expo West in a couple of years, and now unfortunately, when before a few years ago when I used to go, it was really more meeting people I already know instead of kind of new people, right? Because everybody's there, so easy to have meetings, meet other investors, meet companies that you're already in touch with, or you just have gotten in touch with. So I would say, because you're referring to Expo West, it changed. But 10 years ago, I always thought it was interesting to go to an Expo West or others because it wasn't so overcrowded. And you could just basically observe where the consumers would go. And so if you'd see like a big group of people around a brand, that's kind of a good, kind of litmus test of like, interesting. Why are all these people there? Well, maybe there's a celebrity, okay, but maybe it's the product. So let's take a closer look at the product. It's pretty much impossible now, as you just said, right? Because there's so much going on. But I used to love going to those shows because you could really just observe, because it's not about me as the consumer, it's about others at the consumer. But you could observe, like, okay, what's interesting to consumers right now? Is it Greek yogurt, right? Way back when? Is it bottled water with electrolytes or alkaline? Is it protein powders, shakes, bars? Um, I always thought that was interesting. Where do you find the most people around which brand? And then go look at that and talk to the people, talk to the founders. It's very hard to do that right now because there's just so many people, and that's why I think it's become, it's become a networking event more or less, which is fine too.
So are you going to go back to XOS, do you think, or no? Just
Yeah,
because it's
I'll go. When I have time, I always like meeting people there, having conversations. But again, it's not anymore a venue to look
discovery,
at.
like to
It's
actually
not a
discover new brands.
discovery
Yeah.
to look at companies to invest in, as much as it used to be. Um, but you do certainly every year. What I also hear from my team, you see certain themes, right, that are popping up in the food and beverage space. And I think analyzing those themes is super helpful. That's kind of the market mapping around what are trends, what are people thinking about, right? And what we found is these three categories. There's a lot of conversations around sleep, exercise, recovery, and gut health. So
Has it become easier or harder over the years to invest in better for you brands? Because on one hand, I would think there's so much more popping up, so many more companies being made, and so it can be hard to really understand, if you really want to go into a category, which is the company you actually want to back in that category. On the other hand, there's also a lot more retailers that are open to better for you companies. So in terms of route to market, it could actually look quite different and quite unique depending on the company. And there's a lot more kind of data to collect as well, that you can see. So you can maybe you might be able to have more proof points with companies, for example.
I think it's always hard, to be honest. I think we've certainly invested in companies that have done very well and others that haven't, right? For all various reasons. Um, so I couldn't say it's gotten easier or harder. I think it's always hard. So I you know I yeah I think it's always hard. I think you need to pick some, let's say, metrics that you go for, that you look for in companies, and you should stay true to that, right? And as an investor, but also as a company, stay true to your values. What is your offering? As an investor, is like stay true to what you're looking for in a business, right? And of course, a lot has to do with the team, the founder, the execution of the product and service. But I would never say it's gotten easier or harder just because there's more companies there. I think it's always important, and has been 10, 12 years ago, to look for something unique that again is solving a unique issue, a unique problem. And to your point, yes, more companies also means more me too. That's where you need, in my view, to try to shy away from, because if you're not one of the top performers in that category, then you're just a Me Too product, and I think then you're just going to fall by the wayside.
Then how do you then identify maybe what emerging categories are within I know that you mentioned, maybe some three categories, maybe those categories are emerging, maybe they're more on the macro side, but how do you kind of identify more of categories that you think are very niche now, that maybe could become major categories in the future?
I wish I had that magical algorithm there, right? Of that oracle, don't we all, right? Of like, hey, why don't you tell me like what's hot? Um, uh, I think, look, I think most of those most of the analysis are more mainly lag measures versus kind of lead measures. I think everybody's trying to figure out those lead measures of what makes a trend. Now, you can see it through conversations. You can see it through social media engagement. What are people talking about on social media? What is the content that content creators are putting out there that people are interested in? And what we of course see, and that hasn't changed though, is whole body health, health and wellness, longevity. People want to live a healthier, longer life, and they're thinking about how do I do that, and that for me is always a safe bet in companies that you're investing behind, is companies that focus on health and wellness, trying to live a healthier, higher quality life. That's at least our ambition.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like almost the best research that you can do is just keep talking to founders and keep talking to founders, and because they're the ones that are kind of in the route. The beginning, you kind of create a much more specific thesis around a particular trend. You might then miss the trend and might miss it entirely, and almost overthink it, especially since you're investing in like the $1 to $5 million range brand. So
Yeah,
that
and
makes.
again, it's more of a lag measure, but you do realize when you've seen investment proposals in the same category 10 times over a couple of weeks, right? Then you're like, huh, interesting. A lot of founders are thinking about this topic. A lot of founders are interested in solving a specific issue or creating a specific brand around a specific product category. That's when okay, there's something going on there. But again, it'd be nice to have that oracle that kind of tells you, hey, this is going to be the next thing. So it's always slowly moving, but I think health and wellness, whole body health, um, uh, uh, are good safe bets, right? People think more and more about what am I putting on my body, what am I putting inside my body, and I think that's helpful.
How do you assess founders?
Great question. I would say the number one thing is uh, listening. Are they willing to listen? The way that I analyze a founder, if he has a team, let's say they come in for a management meeting, is how much does the founder talk and how much does his team talk? If it's only the founder, it I don't get so excited. If he lets his team speak a lot, because he's hired people to do their job. And if he gives them kind of the room to express their opinion, to share their story, to, talk about the business, that's a really, really good sign for me. If there are management meetings where the founder talks the entire time and the team just sits around and listens, not a good sign, because ultimately that means the founder's not going to be able to let go, and that'll kind of put a dent on growth. So that's one thing. That's kind of one test in management meetings that I look for, is how much does the founder talk versus. But generally, characteristics, of course, are is this ownership principle of do they have not just the passion, but do they have the ownership to and to keep going, because it's always going to be hard. I read something, I think it was a week ago, where somebody commented saying, there's never been a founding story that went like, I started this company, everything went great, and then I sold it, right? So I always like that, because it's very simple in saying it's always hard. Are founders willing to go beyond that when things get hard? Now, you can't really test that until it gets there, but every company and every portfolio will have times where it's going to get really, really hard. And the good founders, they don't quit, right? They keep going. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. How else do you think about investing in consumer brands where, of course, the product is differentiated, but it isn't isn't maybe there maybe isn't a technology innovation or ingredient versus true food tech companies or tech companies where I would imagine they have longer horizon when it comes to maybe outcome or just or the amount of time you're actually partnered with those companies. But how do you think about investing in the differences as well from like an ROI perspective? Because I'd imagine that they are quite different.
Yeah, I think it's the time horizon when you expect to see liquidity, right? Of realizing, and justifying that investment.
Is that more flexible just considering that this is quite a unique venture firm and that you have a single LP, or is it still like a typical time horizon, let's say like 7 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I mean, yes and no. We tend to be, we try to see the world in a flexible way. Why? Because we believe giving the company an opportunity to exit when they deserve or when they've earned their right to exit. But we still have to justify our existence, right, as an investment firm. So we can't hold on to companies forever. But since we are also more of like an evergreen fund, we have a little bit more flexibility. But of course, we have our internal plans on what do we think this company needs from a time horizon perspective. And look, early stage businesses, you're lucky if it's 3 to 5 years. If it's early, it's always more 7 to 10 years. So you got to have some patient capital. Now, I don't like the word patient capital because it always kind of can lead to a conversation like, oh, you guys can wait a little bit longer, you don't need the money. We still have to justify, right, and pay bills and justify to our LP our existence. So it's a little bit of a yes and no. I know it's not the answer you want to hear, but it's a little bit of the yes and no. And every company is different. What we do like to consider ourselves is, we consider ourselves as being, you know, cooperative with the founder and really trying to build a business that leaves something behind and isn't just a flash in the pan, right? It really leaves leaves something better behind, and some companies it takes a little longer, right, to justify that investment longer term, to get to a certain size where strategics will be interested in, or a public market opportunity arises that you then go after.
What are the reasons why a D2C brand, when they actually go into retail, what are some of the reasons that it might not actually work as a retail brand that you mind that it maybe works pretty well as a D2C brand, but they weren't able to kind of cross that chasm and actually create a compelling uh retail businesses retail business. Would just love your thoughts.
Look, I think in simple terms, I think most of it is that they probably on a D2C business spent a lot of money acquiring customers, and that the repeat purchase rate was not that high, and therefore they go into retail with strong, let's say, overall sales numbers. But when you look at the cohorts, when you look at the actual consumer, the lifetime value of that consumer is not high enough to justify going into retail. And in retail, to stay on shelf and be successful, again, of course, it's all about velocity, right? And you can, of course, you have, trade spend that you can use to acquire new customers, but ultimately it's about velocities and repeat purchases. So that's why, again, I think successful brands will focus more on repeat purchases instead of customer acquisitions. The ones that aren't going to be as successful are going to spend a lot of money on customer acquisition, and they might have good sales, but I think that's going to be hard in retail. because you can get on, because it's, I mean, you talk to salespeople, they have this, a lot of salespeople say it's easy to get on shelf, right? But it's hard to get off the shelf. And it's true.
Yeah, totally. How also? 'Cause I know you also invest in technology companies too, and these technology companies can look quite different to consumer companies. The outcomes, successful outcomes, can look quite different to consumer companies. How do you think about underwriting technology companies versus consumer companies trajectory, and as well as maybe desired, if this changes, the desired ROI for each type of business?
Yeah, I mean, the tech companies we've invested in, let's say consumer tech, I would make it similar from an ROI perspective than consumer businesses. We're not tech investors, so that's always very different. But let's say the consumer tech business we've invested in, um, the interesting part about consumer tech is it doesn't just solve a, let's say, demand problem, it also solves a supply problem, right? And I think in consumer tech, that's interesting. CPG, or products, food and beverage, is really more like a demand problem, right? The consumer has a need, and can I fill that need? Can I offer products and services better for you to fill that, to fill that need state? In consumer tech, I think the interesting ones are that focus on demand and supply. So we have a company that we've invested in called Zeal. They provide massage on demand. It's a demand problem. Customers want to have the benefit of a massage at home, and it's a supply issue because there are many massage therapists that have excess time where they could earn money to provide their service. Same thing like an Uber, right? Uber is the same thing. It was a demand problem and a supply problem that was solved. And so in consumer tech, I think once you have that, that's a good investment.
Got it. No, that's helpful in terms of how you think about it, and as well as solving a problem. My final question for you is: what's one book that's inspired you personally, and one book that's inspired you professionally?
So professionally, I thought the book, and maybe you know the name. I forgot the name. I know the cover. It's like blue orange. Just recently that I read that I thought was really interesting. That also helped me a lot as kind of a like as a CEO, and was Ben Horowitz's book.
Yes, yes, yes. Um, the hard thing about the hard thing about hard
Thank
things.
you. The
Yeah.
hard thing about hard things. Um, uh, Personally, my favorite book that I read, way back when, probably, oh God, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, that have always stuck to me is The Pillars of Earth. Yeah, it's a Ken Follett book. It's a Ken Follett book. It's a great story over multiple generations, and it's about building a church. Well, not it's like building a large church, and in England, it's called Pillars of Earth. And the interesting part about it, I always thought, is thinking about building a company. It's brick by brick, right? You start with a strong foundation and you build from that. So I always thought it was interesting how they framed it, that this big cathedral, so large church cathedral, was built over several generations, and nobody really who worked there for generations saw the end product, but everybody was part of that initial journey. I always thought, from a personal level, it was always very inspiring.
That's awesome. I don't think we've had anyone mention the Pillars of Earth, so you're so original, Marcel. This is great. This is great. And hard things about hard things. Yeah, I've heard wonderful
How
things.
many? I was going to say, how many people have mentioned that?
That is mentioned quite a bit. Do you want to know the most mentioned book?
Yes, I do.
Shoe Dog. Shoe Dog is the most
Oh,
mentioned
yeah.
book on the show for sure.
It's a good book. Another book I would recommend is it's a Nigerian writer called Chinua Achebe, and his book was called Things Fall Apart.
Things fall apart.
It's not a big book, small book, but very interesting, especially for
Oh,
like founders, CEOs.
yeah.
It's a great book.
Awesome. That sounds great. I don't think we've had anyone that mentioned when things fall apart. So very original, Marcel. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Marcel, thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Love
you.
to be here.
And there you have it. It was a pleasure having Marcel on the podcast. Marcel, thanks again so much for coming on the show. Thanks also to our partner, Propeller Industries, for supporting the show. If you're really enjoying the show, subscribe to our newsletter at theconsumervc.com, where I share a weekly update of all the consumer deals and news that's happening in the world of emerging consumer. And you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed.